Chapter 38, Section 1, 1968, A Year of Crisis. By 1967, anti-war protesters had turned on President Johnson. Demonstrators chanted, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" To counter growing opposition to the war, the Johnson administration tried to persuade Americans that there was light at the end of the tunnel. Officials presented statistics and reports to show that the United States was winning the war. They showed journalists captured enemy documents that implied the insurgency was failing. LBJ visited military bases where he touted U.S. prospects in Vietnam. LBJ's campaign to restore confidence worked. American support for the war effort increased, at least for a few months. Then, in January 1968, the Viet Cong and NVA started a campaign of their own, also aimed at influencing American public opinion. Tet Offensive changes Americans' view of the war. In the summer of 1967, North Vietnamese military planners decided on a risky new strategy. They would launch attacks on cities in South Vietnam while staging an uprising in the countryside. Communist leaders hoped this strategy would reveal the failure of pacification efforts and turn Americans even more against the war. They planned the attack to coincide with a Vietnamese holiday known as Tet. This holiday marked the Lunar New Year, when many ARVN troops would be home on leave. On January 31, 1968, the Tet Offensive began. Like a shockwave rolling through South Vietnam, some 85,000 Viet Cong and NVA soldiers attacked cities, villages, military bases, and airfields. In Saigon, North Vietnamese commandos blew a hole in the wall surrounding the U.S. Embassy, but U.S. military police fought them off. The North Vietnamese succeeded in holding the city of Hue for nearly a month, but that was their only real military success. In battle after battle, South Vietnamese and U.S. forces pushed back the attackers. As many as 45,000 enemy soldiers, mostly Viet Cong, were killed. In the countryside, no uprising occurred. In fact, the brutality of the communist assault boosted rural support for the South Vietnamese government. Although it was a military disaster for the communists, the Tet Offensive shocked the American people and became a psychological defeat for the United States. On their TV screens, Americans saw enemy soldiers inside the walls of the U.S. Embassy. They saw U.S. bases under attack. They heard journalists' startled reports about the enemy's ability to penetrate American strongholds. No amount of positive analysis from the administration could persuade reporters or the public that this was a U.S. victory. Instead, many Americans saw these statements as another example of a widening credibility gap. Johnson decides not to run for re-election. As public confidence in Johnson fell, the president suffered another sharp blow. This time, it was from the nation's most respected television news anchor, Walter Cronkite. Cronkite, who had traveled to Vietnam to cover the Tet Offensive, delivered an on-camera editorial expressing his view that Johnson had misled the American people. In a solemn voice, he said, "It seems more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate." Hearing this editorial, LBJ remarked, "That's it. If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost America." After Tet, polls showed that only 26% of Americans approved of LBJ's conduct of the war. 2 Democratic senators thought they could do better. Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, a fierce critic of the war, had already entered the race for the Democratic presidential nomination. Now Robert Kennedy of New York, a favorite of civil rights and anti-war activists, announced he would also run against Johnson. LBJ saw Tet as a political catastrophe, but General Westmoreland saw it as an opportunity to finish off the communists. He asked the president for 206,000 more troops. Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford told LBJ that even double or triple that quantity would not be enough to destroy the enemy forces. LBJ decided to reject the increase, leaving U.S. troop levels at around 500,000. He then removed Westmoreland as commander of the U.S. forces in Vietnam. The president also considered Clifford's advice to try to open peace talks. On March 31, 1968, Johnson stood before national television cameras to make a momentous announcement. The United States, he said, would try to de-escalate the conflict by cutting back on the bombing of North Vietnam and by seeking a negotiated settlement of the war. An even bigger announcement followed. LBJ told Americans, "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." The chaotic election of 1968. The war had exhausted the president, and he seemed to think he had lost his political influence. Although LBJ might have won the nomination if he had chosen to run, he threw his weight behind his vice president, Hubert H. Humphrey. In June 1968, Humphrey became the likely nominee when his most experienced rival, Robert Kennedy, was assassinated on the campaign trail by a lone gunman. 1968 had already been one of the most turbulent years in recent American history. The country was reeling from the combined effects of the Vietnam War, anti-war protests and other social unrest, and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Now it was stunned by yet another assassination, this time of one of the leading political figures, and there was more upheaval to come. In August, delegates gathered in Chicago for the Democratic National Convention. Many of them backed the anti-war views of McCarthy. Following a bitter debate, however, the convention endorsed a campaign platform that supported President Johnson's Vietnam policy. Under pressure from LBJ, Humphrey approved the platform and won the Democratic nomination. Meanwhile, thousands of anti-war protesters rallied in parks near the convention center. At times, they confronted police and National Guardsmen called in by Mayor Richard Daley. On August 28th, the violence escalated. A clash occurred between Chicago police and a group of rowdy protesters trying to march into the convention center. Some protesters threw rocks and bottles at the police, and police fired tear gas and beat protesters and onlookers with batons and rifle butts. Americans watching the spectacle on television were appalled. In contrast, the Republican National Convention was a tidy affair. Delegates chose Richard M. Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president, as their candidate for president. Nixon's speech accepting the nomination blasted LBJ and the Democrats. When the strongest nation in the world can be tied up for 4 years in a war in Vietnam with no end in sight, when the richest nation in the world can't manage its own economy, when the nation with the greatest tradition of the rule of law is plagued by unprecedented lawlessness, then it's time for new leadership for the United States of America. Richard M. Nixon, August 8, 1968. Humphrey and the Democrats never quite recovered from their disastrous convention. Nixon connected with voters by promising to maintain law and order at home and secure peace with honor in Vietnam. In November 1968, Americans voted for change, electing Nixon as their new president.